My name is Nicholas Boy-Smith. I'm the founder and the chair of Create Streets, a social enterprise with an associated charity, the Create Streets Foundation. And I'm also the chair of the government's new Office for Place, which is an arm's length body working with and for DLUC, Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities.
From Ackroyd Lowry, I'm Oliver Lowry.
And I'm John Ackroyd.
And this is Urban Forecast, the show where we talk to the people defining the future of our cities. We discuss their background, what drives them, and the insights they've learned along the way.
This is a podcast for anyone who's interested in how we live, work or play in the cities of the future and what that means for the built environment today.
Nicholas, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure. We've been looking forward to this very much. So this is a podcast obviously about the people who are kind of influencing the built environment. And before we started, I sort of said that you've got a very unique position in influencing policy that that can impact upon the places, the streets, the urban environment that we live. But I'd love to start, if we could, at the kind of the start of your journey into these various roles that you now hold. How did you kind of originally decide that the urban realm, the built environment, was going to be something that was going to take your passion and lead into this illustrious career?
Well, I might dispute illustrious, but thank you very much, and thank you for asking me. Well, I mean, I'm as architects frequently say, I ain't an architect, and this is very much my second, some might even say my third career. An interest in architecture, towns, cities, places, streets, the built environment. I know I've always sort of had latently. So, interest in architecture, read about it as a child, as a young adult, but I don't draw very well. It just never even, it never even occurred to me as something to do professionally. I don't say that as a thing of pride. It's just a statement of fact. So I rediscovered actually a couple of years ago a document I had written when I was about 20, which was an attempt to get into public policy making about planning and built environment, which actually has some overlaps, not that many, it has some overlaps with what I've ended up doing 20 years later. So obviously the desire was there, even if not fully sort of self-conscious. I was driving to the B&Q in not that far from where I live in South London about 12 years ago to buy some pot plants with my then very young son. And I noticed they were starting to pull down one of the big estates in South London. And I got curious, always been latently interested. I Googled what they were doing with it. It was, I don't want to name names, but it's one of the Marmite estates, I think one can say, big and brutalist, not something that's historically been associated with high land values, let's put it that way. And I was, at a very superficial level, was very surprised, disappointed, astonished maybe with what it was being replaced by, which to my untutored eyes seemed to replicate many, though not all, of the errors of what it was replacing. And so I just started getting interested. And I'm always curious as to why things happen, particularly about things that don't seem optimum. And so I just started looking at some of the planning processes, some of the building regs, some of the reasons why we build what we build, and above all, what the aims we set ourselves were. And I managed. Sorry, this is probably a longer answer than you wanted. Sorry, forgive me.
You can go for as long as you want.
You can edit it down. Yes, exactly. So no, I ended up managing to have a chat with the guy. I mean, not the master planner, but the guy who sort of run the area action plan program. So like the project manager sitting at the middle of the spider's web, and I asked him questions I was asking professionally. So at the time I was running quite a complex financial services organization or business, which meant, I couldn't be on all the detail, and it was also across multiple countries. So I'd got into the habit, if I didn't understand something, which is quite often, of asking very basic questions, because it's quite a good way of sniffing out, to use a technical term, bullshit. So I asked this guy very basic questions. Where do we like to live? Where are we happy? Where do people want to be? Where are people likely to spend more money to buy a home, or whatever it might be? And it wasn't just that this is why I'm not saying where it is, because I'm about to be a bit rude, but it wasn't just that he couldn't answer my questions, which he palpably couldn't, but it was that he clearly thought I was quite naive and, dare I say, even stupid for sort of asking what to me seemed quite important questions. Now, fair enough, he's not an architect, he wasn't the master planner, but he was the guy at the heart of the process. So I think it's a reasonable thing to expect him to have a point of view on, even if it's secondhand. And so that knocked me off. And I guess that was there were two moments. That was the first moment, which sort of started the process of starting to read about precisely those questions. And my hobby previously, when I worked in other sectors, was writing policy papers and looking at why we do what we do, because it often we don't necessarily intend to. And I started working up the paper, and I started talking to lots of people in spare moments over a year or so. And I then shared a draft with my dearest and oldest friend, who I've known since I was about 13, And again, I'm afraid I'm going to use a rude word, forgive me. And he read it, and he phoned me up, and he said, "You lucky bastard, you found what you're going to do for the rest of your life." And it was again, it was sort of second Kachung moment, because I think, well, I don't think it's a fact. I mean, where we live and where we spend our days is incredibly important to us as individuals and as societies and as neighbourhoods and as communities. It profoundly impacts all of us. And it is very necessary, quite rightly, it's something that the state takes a view on, even if you don't think it should. As a statement of fact, the state always has. So let's line that up to what happy and the evidence on good and resilient and sustainable living patterns. And I think it has got better actually over the last decade, but I don't think that was happening 10, 12 years ago. And going to talk to people who credibly talked to me, say, right, 10 years ago, talked about placemaking, I didn't think they were using language or argument or data or empirical research in a way that I judged was likely to influence, a pension fund manager, a major investor, a senior treasury official, or indeed a senior politician. So it was a combination of a language they were using, which was quite cliche, the wrong word. It was quite jargonesque, and the often lack of evidence linking elements of urban morphology and placemaking through to components of the good life, which I thought was missing. And so, to finally answer your question, it seemed to me these things were important, interesting, something I was clearly, I would say, passionate, others might say obsessed by, and that I want to get involved with. So that's what led to me writing a paper and then ultimately giving up my job, or previous job.
Yes, so I was going to say, is that moment, that eureka moment or epiphany, was that because I think you had initially advised the government back in 2006, is that right? You were doing advisory roles?
A little bit older than that, I fear. So my very, very first job, literally between being an undergrad and a postgrad, was as a very junior political advisor. I then worked in the city and strategy consultancy for a while, and then as a sort of part-time thing, in about 2005-06, I was secretary to something called the Tax Reform Commission, looking at quite abstruse elements of the fiscal system, the case for flat tax, the case for elements of complexity in the tax system and how that impacts behaviour and the degree to which you do or don't get fiscal drag. So so I did that, and I did a lot of work in
the private sector, happily doing whatever you were doing, financial advice. And then you go, no, that I need to be drawn back to policy. And is that how it happened?
I did pretty much. It wasn't the. I mean, I knew enough. As you get older, you hopefully know yourself a little bit better. I knew that I was very interested in policy, but I didn't think I had the right temperament, certainly not the right desire to be a politician. Where you need to be, it's a pretty brutal world. I have an unfashionably positive view of most politicians, not all, but most. I think on both centre left and centre right. Actually, most politicians are incredibly hardworking. Nearly all of them could earn more doing something else. Not all of them, and they take a lot of stick. They get people telling them they're corrupt. It's always questioning their motives and their incentives. So I have an unfashionably positive view of politicians, but no, I wouldn't want to be one because I think it's so tough. So, but this seemed to be an area A, that I was passionate about, and B, where I thought I could make an influence. I just couldn't see anyone talking about it in a way that I thought needed to be done. So that was and so I did a deal with my wife, whereby the deal was, if after 6 months no one's listening, or no one's paid us any money to do anything, I probably better go back to what I was doing before. But fortunately, the first the first sort of paid thing came in about 5 months, and I did manage to get people talking to me and paying attention. So I was able to crack on, which is where I'm still.
And that was Create Streets at the time. So 2012, you launched that. Is that right?
Good research. So I legally created the company from memory in 2012. I quit my job at the end of 2013.
I see.
So we've just had our 10-year anniversary.
Congratulations, us as well.
Thank
actually, we
congratulations.
Yeah. Well, no, other this year, so it's coming up. 2014 we started.
Congratulations.
And time flies, doesn't
it? We meant to have a party, but we sort of forgot about it, so we didn't.
Well, we're definitely having a party. Maybe we could do a joint one. Yeah.
Maybe your colleagues. I don't know. But anyway, but always
street party, the Create Streets party.
Well, we have just moved. We did consider doing one for the coronation. We've just bought actually and moved into a former shop on Lambeth Walk, and we've literally just painted the fascia board. So we are definitely going to be doing things in Lambeth Walk, which, as you obviously know, is a historic London street with a very interesting story to tell.
Yes, so that I mean that leads us very well into what I was going to ask before that slide.
Sorry, did I muck up your question? Sorry, Oliver.
Which is, so what was the sort of founding manifesto of Create Streets? And in a sort of broad sense, what were you trying to advocate for?
A manifesto might be too grand a word, but a range of linked points. One, self-evidently, we're shy of quite a few million homes in the UK, and above all in the southeast and in London, and that really matters. And those of us, I can now say this about myself, above a certain age, we bought our home before, if you like, the prices did that, and we're sort of all right, Jack. Most people working for me, anyone under the age of 40, certainly in the southeast, who's not doing quite a finite number of jobs, is facing challenges of affordability and of quality of living and disposable income, which basically mean they are poorer in relative terms than their parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents' generation, literally back to the 1920s. So that's point one of our, I think, our founding manifesto, that this matters and it's something we've got to care about. Point two, and I probably wouldn't have put it in quite these terms 10 years ago, is that as a society, as a culture, you might almost say, we've fallen out of love with the future. And the instinctive assumption of the vast majority of British people, the vast majority of the time, is that, and this is empirically true, is that new development will make existing places worse. If that is true, and I think it is, then the politics of this are always going to be jolly hard. However, and you often sort of get developers or professionals saying, the politicians need to provide leadership. Well, if all of the public are against it, it's you can provide leadership for a few months or a couple of years, and then you're going to stop being the politician in charge because they're going to vote for the other guy, which is what happens. And we saw that in the local elections last year, where there was a wave of, I won't go into naming parties, but of independents or of other entree parties winning in the Shire counties because they were very, very clearly opposed to stuff building on greenfield sites. So don't have enough homes. As a society, you need to fall back in love with the future. Three, what I've now called, I don't think I did at the time quite, the case for gentle density, to get many of the we could perhaps come back to that in more detail, but advantages of propinquity and high density, but also some advantages of personal space and control over your built environment, both matter. There's a quite for trade-off, but that's a way to get much higher density development without people minding that, with people paying a premium. And then the process matters, i.e., again, to use a phrase I didn't use at the time, how do we pull the democracy forward and get more firmly embedded into the local plan or into associated supplementary documents? Bluntly, something that the local community and series of neighbourhoods recognise as what they want development to look like and be like, and that covers a range of factors which we again go into more detail. And so so it matters what people like, and again, living in a democracy has all sorts of disadvantages, but it's definitely better than the alternatives. It matters what people like. It matters that we have lost confidence in new places and placemaking. It matters that we don't have enough homes, and there are ways of getting advantages of density without falling into the traps of hyperdensity, and there are ways of getting the advantages of personal space and access to private gardens and safe walkable streets without falling into the dangers of sort of dropping cul-de-sacs into a field. So that's probably a little bit more cogent. Well, maybe it's not cogent at all. I don't know. But anyway, I don't think I'd have put it quite like that 10 years ago. But I mean, that bluntly.
Yeah, 10 years of hindsight helps in some.
But it was certainly a version of that. I think, in fairness to myself, it was a version of that we have pretty much always said. I think what we've done over the last decade is the number of projects we've done has expanded massively. Some of the places we've done has expanded massively as the team has grown from me in the dining room now to 10 of us. The degree to which we think in terms of a virtuous circle of place, the relationship between sustainability, resilience, walkability, greenery, prosperity, value. I hope that perhaps not the complexity, perhaps the coherence of our ability to draw the links between those hopefully has improved over the last decade. Question mark.
I just want to stop on one of the points there, because I think it's interesting. I said before we started, there's lots and lots of things I agree with you entirely about? And
I've several. Forgive me, I'm interrupting your question. Quite often, Oliver, I speak to architects and they say, "Well, I'm actually agreeing with you far more than I thought. It's a bit disconcerting." So I hope I can.
Yeah, and I think I definitely agree with a lot of the background. I don't always agree with the conclusion you come to, but I agree with the context by which you might come to those conclusions. So,
well, you probably suffer from the design disconnect, Oliver. We can come back to that.
Probably.
I'm being provocative and a little bit rude. Please forgive me.
I will. Falling out of love with the future. Does that necessarily translate to a desire to bring back the past? Because nothing that you said in that introduction made me think that you would necessarily want to bring back the language of the past. And it's an accusation. It's something that might be associated with some of the things that you and the new king might like, sort of Poundbury-esque developments. Do you see a relationship between the language of the past being used, or do you?
Why do you say language? It's interesting that you say language, not places. I'm quite surprised by that.
Yeah, because this is a sort of maybe it's my misunderstanding of some of the positions that you take around design language. I think design codes or something.
Okay, so you by language. Sorry, I misunderstand. You don't mean words. You mean
no.
What is
I'm an architect. Okay. When I say language, I mean
I see. Sorry, I naively use language to mean words. I won't do it again. Forgive me. Yeah. No, I understand. I understand your point.
But yes, so it's that visual language. Do you think that using the sort of echoes of the past in a design language assists in bringing people on board with proposals for what the future should look like?
Point one, I think, would be that the places of the future can't, won't, shouldn't look precisely the same or be precisely the same as the places of the present or the past. There are always things that are changing in what we can do economically, in the economics of the creation of buildings, technologies available, regulatory and regimes that we're working under. So that'll never happen. Literally just in the last, and I'm pleased about this. This is something I have advocated, and I think in a small way helped achieve. Now that we've got the requirement for biodiversity net gain in new planning applications, and now that we've got the requirement for new street trees in the streets, any development built now is going to look a bit different in a good way, I hope, to anything built even a couple of years ago. So at a very simple question level of taking your question, no, in the sense that things always change, and to try and fight that ad infinitum would be insane. Second point would be, and I guess this is the sort of perhaps also a Burkean point. We can't live as humans in a perpetual state of ceaseless revolution. I mean, it's exhausting, and it's also very unwise. So, forgive me. We've never met in person. I'm looking at your office. You've got roof trusses there. You've got a crittle window. You're wearing spectacles. You've got a shirt. We're always having to. You use the word language. Perhaps I use the word patterns. We're always reusing and adapting and evolving and copying patterns that have worked before. And anything else is just it's impossible to have the future identical to the past. So, I would argue. I think anyone sensible would agree, it's also impossible to have a future which is completely different to the past, because we're humans, we're roughly the same shape, we have roughly the same physiological and psychological needs as our forefathers and foremothers, therefore we're going to copy as well. So my point would be that we should be in communion both with the past and the future, and that just as it's absurd to say we can't change things, so it's absurd to say we can't copy. We should do both, and we should basically be open-minded about what we adapt, what we copy, what we evolve, what we completely reinvent. And there are advantages to both and disadvantages to both. It is a statement of fact that for most of us, I think for all of us, though perhaps in different ways, place is emotional. Where we spend our time, our concept of home is not a purely rational thing, or it's only purely rational if you're taking it to the level of our need for psychological comfort, which I guess is rational ultimately. And that for most of us, not everyone, places where we wish to spend time, our neighbourhood, are probably going to have some similarities to where we grew up or what we aspire to be. We should be open to both. And just as it would be ridiculous to say, I would think, we can't be open to new materials and new things, I wouldn't argue that. So it's ridiculous to say we can't copy from the past. I certainly get uncomfortable when, I'll use the word you might have in your mind, if we say that anything that we copy from the past prior about 1920 is pastiche in inverted commas, then anything we copy post about 1920 is, that seems to me illogical. I'm happy to copy from both and happy to not copy from both. I just think we should sort of follow the evidence of where people want to live and how. Then perhaps a final point. Again, you mentioned sort of, I think you used an adjective, Poundbury-esque. I mean, let's look at the data on Poundbury. And there's an interesting Oliver Wainwright article on this from a few years ago, though more recent data shows it even more clearly. So Poundbury has a higher density than anything you'll ever see from a volume house builder, about a third to half as high. It's got more sustainable, social housing, affordable housing, I think from memory about 30%, I think just over. It's got far more jobs within the urban frame than, again, anything else you'll see from a volume house builder. It's about one job per household, though admittedly not all the people who are in those households doing those jobs and vice versa. And because of the greater density and the higher value per square foot, last time I looked, which is a while ago, I might have this number slightly wrong, I think it was about a 52% value premium per hectare as a function both of density and of high propensity to live there. So should every place look like Poundbury? No, clearly not. Should we be open to creating urban extensions to existing towns, much less road infrastructure, at nearly double the density of what we normally cough up, with people paying more to live there, and it can therefore afford a high proportion of affordable housing? I mean, it's quite hard. I mean, I defy anyone to really unless you really have a problem with sash windows as a sort of psychological content, I think it's quite hard to make a data rational argument against that in terms of providing more desperately needed new homes and actually slightly more sustainable, not perfectly sustainable living patterns. That's not to say it's perfect, and I certainly wouldn't say so. It's interesting seeing how the number of cars per home has decreased as you go through from phase 1 to phase 4. I think they're on now. So they've learned as they've gone, and they've certainly made some mistakes. I could go into that. There you go. So I hope that's probably, again, a long answer to a short question, but hopefully that is unpacking some of my thinking about what we can and can't and should and shouldn't do.
No, that was a very good answer, and
thank you.
Again, one that I find it difficult to entirely disagree with. I think that that's
the right response.
No, I think it's true. Like I wouldn't want to say is that Poundbury is the best way to do urban extensions in all contexts.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. Look at Duanthorpe. I mean, you've got Duanthorpe, which is much smaller, so it's perhaps it's a bit of an unfair comparison, but that's an extension to York. I think that's done in what you might call a sort of new modernish vernacular, quite courteous to the street, quite courteous to people walking down the street. That's not Poundbury. Well, it's Poundbury-esque in some ways. A very good street pattern, very good street design, and it's got I think much of the texture and variety in a pattern that I know most people seem to prefer. So yeah, I agree. There are different ways of doing it, as there should be.
And I think that there's once you're in an urban context, I think that the rules of Poundbury go out the window. So I think
No, so there I disagree, because you still need good block patterns, you still need good enclosure ratios, you still need walkable streets, you still need street trees. How you do them, what they are, what that enclosure ratio is might vary. But I have not seen any evidence that the elements of good urban morphology, of variety in a pattern, of coherent complexity and a sense of place are not. I don't say they apply everywhere, because perhaps that's not true. They certainly apply in the vast majority of people. So I would courteously and I hope constructively challenge that. That's not to mean you build Poundbury, but you apply the same pattern in a different way to a different place. But it's elements, the same pattern.
You can change the scale. You can change the scale, and still all of those things be true. So you can have good block patterns. You can have urban realm. It doesn't always have to be streets. So Elephant Park, Elephant and Castle before, pretty bad place, now pretty cool place. And Elephant Park is an amazing example of placemaking, where all of those things that you said are exemplified by Poundbury are the case, but the scale is different. There are buildings that are 20, 30, 40 stories tall, but the ratios are correct. It doesn't always have to be low density.
But so, as you obviously know, and perhaps you worked on it, Elephant Park has basically put back the street pattern. So you've got, I forget the name of the street, it's Wanstead Street or something like that, where they've essentially stuck in a new row of terraced houses that essentially complete the street, mended the scar that was there before, and then they've done a series of blocks, stepping back with enclosed private space, stepping up to the much bigger buildings that face onto Elephant Park. So I would agree, and it's quite nicely textured. You've got a clearly identified ground floor, piano nobile, and then it steps up. And you've even got what look like all real windows as you go up. A staggering set of things. I've cited Elephant Park in several things I've written. So no, I would agree with that. But I would argue that it's using, perhaps not all, but many of the same patterns. So I agree in a much high volume context. One thing if I may, just on tall buildings, which is important, I think. I wouldn't make an existential case against towers or very, very high density or very high buildings. They have their place, near central London, or indeed central London or big cities. It probably is that place. They have their advantages, probably many more homes. I mean, they have disadvantages too. They create microclimates. Historically, maybe this won't be true in the future, I doubt it, they've been much less resilient buildings, much less able to adapt to changing expectations of sustainability or thermal performance. As you know, many of the towers we built a generation or two ago are really underwater now in all sorts of ways. And nearly about 80-90% of the evidence associates them with less good well-being outcomes for residents. Now, that doesn't mean they can't work. The evidence is strongest for children, but I think when you've got either commercial uses, on the whole more prosperous people, often with second homes, it has to be said, as a pied a terre, as a way of living without a garden in a high density, high mixed use area, great, all for it. I mean, it creates some wind effects and makes the street around it a little less nice, but that's often, that might be the right trade-off. It is the right trade-off in some circumstances. I always get very nervous. We were having a conversation about this morning. When you speak to a campaigner for one thing, whether that's street trees, I'm pro street trees, or it's cycle lanes, I'm pro cycle lanes, or it's building more homes, I'm pro building more homes. When you max out on one element of urban design at the expense of everything else, you nearly always end up with a really bad thing. So let's look at post-war housing. They came to two insights, didn't they? So had data on this, but they correctly said two things. We need more light in homes, and we need more greenery than we had in late Victorian London. Those are both correct statements. However, if you max out on both of those and don't think about all the elements of urban morphology or walkability or safety as you go to the front door, you end up with a bad outcome, which I'd argue is often, though not always, what we did. So we kept the density about the same, or indeed took it down, but took people out of houses and put them into a flat on the 15th floor. I mean, that was a less good outcome very often for many of the people who were put in those flats. So, but the desire to create light and the desire to create greenery were good things, but you've just got to hold them in tension with other things, I'd argue. And I don't think that's that controversial.
Thank you so much. So, Nicholas, that was a slight detour via our opinions, which are actually quite aligned. But what I hadn't quite finished asking you was about how Create Streets led to your role at the Office for Place, and what those that new role is, and the kind of responsibilities involved in that.
Create Streets has initially largely did writing and policy work, looking at the relationship between planning and other elements of policy or investment patterns and risk and what we build, partly because that's what I personally can do. Very quickly, in fact, almost immediately, once we published our first report, I got people approaching me, as in neighbour groups, community groups, parishes, neighbour forums. I mean, really quite a lot. It was sort of quite surprising, asking for help, which I'll be the first to admit I was not qualified to give. So the first scheme which we sort of got involved with on the ground we worked up a counter proposal working for and with residents, a place called Mount Pleasant on the Camden-Islington border, and I essentially had no money, but put together an alliance or a network of very experienced professionals, residents, then finally managed to get some money and work that up. So to answer your question, so Create Streets became a sort of combination of, and I think it's a good thing, of looking at the national and the local or regional policy or planning and other risk, and then actually getting involved in the ground on, above all, urban design, linking through to sort of writing the framework and setting the framework to what can be built, and above all, thinking about co-design and the right way to do that actually understands what people like rather than just being manipulated. So I won't name the developer, but I remember one of the early community engagement evenings I sat in on, taking notes, listening to what was said, and then subsequently read what the developer said had been said, and thought, well, I can see how this isn't completely mendacious. It's not sort of utterly, totally nothing to do with what happened that evening, but it's not got very much to do with what happened that evening. So, how do we honestly understand what people like and feed that in a way that doesn't add cost? So we started doing both of those things. And I think it's probably fair to say that quite a lot of what we started saying, I started saying, did start getting picked up in the wider political debates, GLA, government, and some local councils. And that led to me being asked to sit on and then latterly co-chair a commission for the government about 4 or 5 years ago, our final recommendation, that was called the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, and our final recommendation was that a body should be set up, to if you like, monitor what happens with this and to make sure this agenda of better, more popular, more sustainable places wasn't lost, because when you're 4 million homes short, it's quite easy to lose that. So rather to my surprise, I was then asked to chair the process. I mean, genuinely to my surprise, was asked to chair the process of creating that, which I've just been doing for the last couple of years. And so that has led. So we the Office of Place now. I can talk about it in more detail in a moment, but we now legally exist as of last year, and we have a team of officials which we're growing. Our home is the marvellous city of Stoke-on-Trent, and I chair the board on that. And our role, to come back. So. You're in my career rather than us. So my role is to chair the board and make sure it happens, and set strategy and make sure we get the right chief executive and the right senior team to do it. The role of the Office for Place is to help councils. Now that councils have got far greater requirements on them to set popular local plans, to set visual local plans, to set local plans, I hope, that are more green, more walkable and sustainable, is to help them do that, because it's actually quite different to what they've done for the last few generations. We've been running, again, unintentionally, we've been running a sort of almost a controlled experiment in this country of having a very different planning system to that, probably to most countries, and I would argue not in a good way. So we've had a much higher level of planning risk. We've had planning documents, planning policies, local plans, which tend to be very verbal, tend to leave many things open. And there's a case for that. I mean, that's very good at dealing with the idiosyncratic and the eccentric. These are good things. It's much less good at allowing for a full and complex market of house builders, because it essentially creates a huge barrier to entry of high planning costs and high planning risk. And it is no coincidence that we've ended up with a very concentrated market, very dependent on a small number of volume house builders. It's not to criticise them, but they're the people who can cope with the high level of risk involved. And with very, very low market shares for self-build, custom build, local builders, market entrance, modular, because the costs and risk are just so high. So our job as the Office Place is to help local councils not to have a bonfire of the regulations. This isn't about stopping planning. It's about, in a way that the local populace will accept, it's about de-risking development, de-risking planning and thus development, by setting a clearer quality ask with a clearer straight line through to the full permission, outline permission, or in some cases local development or neighbour development orders or other mechanisms where that's there. So that's ultimately our role. So yes, I'm doing that, and I guess we're particularly interested. I guess it sort of reflects the political debate of the last few years. I think it'll reflect political debates the next few years as well, under whatever colour government. We're particularly interested in what I currently call the left behind places. And as I'm sure you know, Oliver, it's really very depressing going to lots of historic, often ex-industrial towns up and down the country, but also towns in quite prosperous places, and their middles are just hollowed out. The shops are empty. There's no one living above the shops. There's a gyratory running straight through the road next to the high street. And meanwhile, we're sort of sticking boxes on the ring road with, the local council office in it, or with, the doctor's surgery. So we're hollowing out our towns. So of course, that means that the amount of land we require to meet our own services just expands, literally exponentially. And we're not America. So there's a limit to how long we can do that. And at the same time, I think quite reasonably, the general population don't want us to build all over the greenfields, and we've got a strong greenbelt policy. So, if you have all these things fighting each other, you don't end up with enough homes, and you certainly don't end up with patterns of living where it's easy for children to jump on a bicycle and go to school, or to just roam around the natural space, or roam around the towns and everywhere else. And there's fascinating research on this showing how the scope of children to move around towns and cities has collapsed over the last 3 generations. I'm definitely giving too much detail, so I'll stop there. Anyway, that's what we're.
I'm loving the detail. I mean, I honestly, I would have just responded with some ideas of my own if
well,
please
do.
Just, you've got to get some more significant density into the town centres of people living there, because that's the only place you're going to shop is either people shop online or they shop right outside their front door, or they shop at Westfield. The kind of that, like, nobody's traveling to kind of little high streets, so you've got to get more people back in town centres if you want them to be.
Absolutely, and I tend to use the words, and I don't disagree with that. I tend to use the word intensity rather than density. Yeah. I mean, not to disagree with you, but because I think that conveys the sense that it's about that mix of uses as well as about the number of people living there. And I'd also add 2 things, both which I think you'd agree with. One of which is we've got to be really careful about trying, and this is addressed to any council officials watching, about trying to over-manage the use of buildings. So we cannot know what people's requirements for shops or coffee shops or restaurants or offices or homes will be 5 years out, let alone 10 or 20. Or so we've got to create and allow high streets, and critically, in a way, we want to talk about town centres rather than high streets, because the ecosystem of streets off it, in a way, matters more. Got to allow them to flex within some constraints. So, you're not going to put iron smelting works next to a high street, and you're not going to put, a disco open until 6 o'clock in the morning, in the middle of a residential quarter. So, there are some reasonable sort of barriers as to what's acceptable in town or neighbourhood centres. But within those centres of reasonability, within those sort of constraints of reasonability, I think we've got to be very careful about trying to overmanage that. So allowing that variety of uses to evolve relatively naturally, I mean, not completely, and then making the place people want to go to. And again, you can see this time after time. There are, and we were talking about language versus pattern earlier, and so Poundbury versus Elephant Park. There are really clear patterns about the type of places people want to be. They can get there. It's enjoyable, not just safe, but enjoyable to walk around. It's nice to look at. It's a place they want to take their kids or meet people, or that if it's near their home that they feel proud of. These patterns keep repeating, and you can easily, I'm afraid you can see this in too many town centres, get into a vicious circle of place where those things cease being true, and indeed you can get into a virtuous circle of place. And you tend to get, if you look at the economic data on where people live over time, you tend to get what economists call sorting effects, i.e. the better connected, nicer places, guess what, where the rich people live, and they tend to get better and better connected over time, and vice versa. Now, to some degree, local government's role, I mean, you can fight against that. You have to accept those patterns are there, and then you mellow them out. But you can't sort of completely make them go away. You could just try and sort of spread it around a bit. But let's come in and make the less prosperous places nicer, and that, of course, gets you into debates about gentrification, which we can come back to. But we've got, we can't just create poor places where only poor people would want to live. That seems to me, fundamentally inhumane.
Yes.
But no, it's absolutely
regeneration when
crucial.
it's done well can end it can spin around the cycle of a hollowing out. It can provide a sort of reversal to that. If there's a place draining out, it can bring people back in, and that's when architecture and regeneration is done very well. I think that's what it does. But I just had a question on the sort of the tools that the Office for Place, the levers that you have to use. It seems from what I've read and from what you said that the most effective tool that the Office for Place will have is the local plans. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that's largely fair. I mean, I'd preface my answer to your question by saying there's lots of things relevant here, and I haven't actually mentioned them. Also, just one other thing I'd mention is obviously transport and fast cars. We Create Streets did some research a few years ago where I forget if it was the 5 or the 10 least prosperous places in England, as measured. All of them have got a fast dual carriageway either running through their middle or at least along one side of them. And certainly several of the very non-prosperous communities that Create Streets has got projects in at the moment, they're all, if you like, the wrong side of the dual carriageway, just from the town centre and in some left behind places. So, there are things that matter which are not strictly within the Office Place purview, but that's not to say they don't matter. It's just to say, we can't do everything, and anyone who tries to do everything will probably fail. But yes, to come back to your answer, I think if we can help local councils alongside the digitisation of the planning process and the digitisation of design and of development, all of which is clearly it's happening, little and coming. If we can get to a situation where, let's describe a hypothetical town outside the southeast. This is actually true, surprising number of places in the southeast, but if it's a town where there are lots of either empty or underused sites or part sites, and there are a lot of those, where right now the economics just does not stack up. So the land values are very low. It might often have heritage buildings nearby. No one's looked at what the infrastructure on the ground for X years, and in some cases, Stoke-on-Trent, for example, is one of these. You've got the danger potentially of industrial ex-colliery stuff underground, because a lot of Victorian or earlier collieries were very small, and they just stuck some stone over them in 1850 or something. And what's there? So you've got legitimate risks and costs. So it's just very hard to come in and do anything in some of these sites. But if we can get to a situation where we're digitizing them, and it's not we all the Office Place, but making better available the underground information that's happening, and where it's really clear that in all these streets here, in all these types of plots here, as long as you build one of these 4 types of building or uplift in this way in one of the following 5, I'm making this up obviously, the 5 material types, the following 3 window types with this typology and this framework up to this height, essentially you can go straight through into local development order and you've got no planning risk. I mean, you just have to do what you say you're going to do. So you've got a bit of legal risk, but nothing else. Now, that doesn't mean to say we should only build those buildings, but it does mean to say that's a way of taking a huge barrier to entry out of that market.
Do you know there's just such a risk that you don't quite know how that might be used, and possibly you might end up with a very odd place?
Well, we end up with some pretty odd places right now, places where there's nothing going on. I don't
agree with that, but I think at least we understand the system. Like, planning is hard, planning is very complicated, and more you're required to provide an incredible amount of information.
Yeah, and
nobody wants to take the risk on saying that it's all okay. So you sort of end up, in very lengthy arguments about very small parts of a
well, I mean, I think you're answering your own question. But
at least we understand that version. If you say, well, you don't need the planning system,
I'm not saying that. That's not what I'm saying. That's very carefully not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, sorry to interrupt your question, but I'm saying that you've got these trade-offs between height, urban form, materials, patterns, value. And at the moment we're running a system, and it's got worse in many ways, where literally on a case-by-case, discretionary, every single time basis, your clients, your developers, they need to hire you probably to do a pre-app bit of work. You need to hire their tree officer, they need to hire the ground engineers. You've got a lot of money to spend up front. If you don't get planning permission, you have burnt all that money. Mm-hmm. That's why most of these sites never come forward. We're doing some work right now for a minor landowner in Cambridgeshire. 100 years ago, I'm not saying this was the right answer what we've done 100 years ago, I'm really not, but 100 years ago, she would have just hired a builder to build some homes on this land she owns coming into a little village, and she'd have had to follow some local regulations, and that would have been that. Right now, she's got a bit of land. It's not big enough to interest a land promoter. It requires an amount of expenditure that she can't do. So it's stuck there. So in an area of enormously high demand, land's just sitting there. And there's hundreds, thousands of those sites for different reasons, essentially unable to move forward, precisely because all of that work is required. Now, all of that work does have a purpose. I'm not saying that is without purpose. Can we, as a society, back to where we used to be, replicate what they do in much of the world, where we say we can set a local code, a local policy, we can regulate what we build, so that within some carapaces, it is tick box. We accept that up to this point, it may not be perfect, but it's good enough, and we do sort of need this. I think, but let me put the question back. What is it that's unique about Britain that means that we uniquely can't do that? I've got a friend who's quite senior in what we would call a registered social a provider in France. He runs the development arm of this. It's not quite the same, but it roughly maps on. His guys can do an appraisal assessment for a site in about an hour and a half. They'd never ever hire anyone else to help them, because it's basically just a little bit of spatial maths. What is it that the local code d'urbanisation allows us to do? Is that something we can take forward? Yes or no? They just don't need to go. They will in some sites, but just for the normal bog standard stuff, they just don't have that level of cost and complexity and uncertainty and what I call planning by PDF report up front. That's not to say it doesn't have a purpose, but I guess my hope is, and I think you can start to see this in some places, is that for good ordinary development in normal places, that's not everything, we can bring the democracy forward and do what they do in France, in Denmark, in Holland, in Germany, in bits, but not all of the states, starting to do increasingly in Australia. Ireland's complicated, and say, look, let's just set clear boundaries of what's acceptable, and then allow people to do essentially what they like within that, and they need to tell us the truth. If you lie and say you're going to do that and do something else, then you've got into a different situation. I don't see why we're unique that we can't do that.
Well, one of the things that might be an issue at the moment is that to create those frameworks, which obviously have to be particular to a place, to a local authority, will presumably require quite a lot of investment and resource. And
you as an architect should be pleased about that, Oliver. It's work for you guys potentially. Not easy.
Well, yes, it depends how they get done. But at the moment, I think local authorities are struggling with the funding of their basic services. So is this not adding another layer of stuff that might get done?
I think that's a very fair challenge, and I think it's at one level I agree. And this is the perpetual challenge of spend to save. In the terms you asked the question, I think that's correct. I guess then that falls back upon government, society, How do we, and it's part of the point of having an office of place, how do we learn from others? How can we, what bits can we adapt from elsewhere? What best practice can we adapt? What can we get better at doing? How can we share from what people have done elsewhere? So I think that's if we get ourselves in a situation where every single local plan costs many hundreds of thousands of pounds and takes years and years, then it's not going to happen. We've got to make it more efficient than that. Now, this is speculating. I think some things will be more adaptable across the country than others. So we can't want to say I don't want to cost a fortune here, but my hypothesis, based on some of the work Create Streets has done and what I'm seeing up and down the country, is that street design, block patterns, how you cope with parking. I wouldn't say there are no local specificities. There clearly are, but what's right in Cumbria, what's right in Cornwall, what's right in Surrey and Sussex and Cheshire will probably have far more in common than it might do for, say, building materials or some other slightly more idiosyncratic things. It's quite interesting when you talk to or run surveys, and we do this, people about what they want new development to look like. People are incredibly responsive and aware, or even when they don't realise they are, to what local building materials historically have been. Certainly in the countryside, perhaps less so in larger towns, or perhaps not at all really in cities. So as the data on that becomes more available, for example, Historic England just made a really good advance on this. There's now a really good online usable map of what local stones historically were used and what's still available. That basically, just thinking a couple of projects my team have been involved with, that's made our lives much easier just in the last 18 months, the last 12 months actually. The same is going to start happening. I think it's starting to happen for other things. So yes, I think your challenge is fair, and my job and the job of others and I hope of the professions over the next couple of years, I hope is to minimise that. I won't say to get rid of it, because I think the challenge will remain.
Thank you very much. That's a good answer. So that leads us on to my final question. I suppose we're looking at an election in the next 12 months. What is the role of the office of a place going to be transferred onto a new government colour potentially? Are you in contact with Angela Rayner or Keir Starmer about moving this work forwards if there is a change in government?
Answer. Once a bit of government exists, it exists, and obviously any future government can ultimately do whatever it likes. And quite rightly so. I'm very reassured. No, that's the wrong word. Creating enough homes and creating homes which people want to live and can know their neighbours and feel at peace in the world. So much the spirit of Create Streets. I don't think that should be too partisan. There are always people who can make those sort of things partisan. That's certainly not the spirit in which I try and approach it. I don't think it's a sensible spirit to approach it. When you look at the polling as to what people like and where, it's really very uninfluenced by politics. Interesting, the same is true in the States, which is a more bifurcated society than ours, sadly for them. And I think some of the things that Keir Starmer was saying in his speech at the Labour conference last year about gentle density, about creating urban extensions that are walkable and that map into existing places, and of the advantages of the Georgian terrace typology, and that some things that the opposition have been saying. Neither they nor the government will thank me for saying this, but I think are pretty nature similar to a lot of things that Michael Gove has been saying, no doubt using slightly different language. And certainly the work the Office of Place is doing is with councils of both red and blue and yellow and various other colours, and you get slight differences, but not huge ones. If people oppose new housing, that matters whatever your politics. I think nearly everyone accepts the point that the types of places we create need to be sustainable and resilient. And I stress the resilience and as well as sustainability. And I think the living patterns that they engender. I don't think it's controversy for some people, but not for everyone. So I would be reasonably hopeful that in some way this agenda of beautiful, sustainable, and resilient placemaking is one that will continue. And indeed, I think Keir Starmer said that their aim was to create prosperous towns and beautiful cities, which I think is a sensible aim for any political leaders to have.
Well, on that note of beautiful towns and wonderful cities, or whatever it was, then I'd like to thank you very much for your time. It's been absolutely fascinating. So thank you very much.
Oliver, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for asking. Thank you for being tolerant with my, no doubt, far too long answers. And it's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you.
If
you enjoyed the show, then please subscribe and give us a review, ideally a 5-star one. And if you want to know more, please go to ackroydlowry.com or follow us on Twitter @ackroydlowry and Instagram with the same. This podcast supports Land Aid, the property industry charity that brings together the sector to deliver life-changing projects for young people who really need it. Visit www.landaid.org to find out how you can help end youth homelessness.